Okay, tonight we're going to be looking at a couple of things having to do with the Kingdom of David, which is a second subdivision of the United Kingdom, period. The first division of the study runs from 1 Samuel chapter 16, where David is anointed while Saul was still king, until the first chapter of 2 Samuel, when he was brought to the realization that Saul had been killed. During this period of time, David was a king, but he was a fugitive king without a kingdom, or at least without a visible kingdom. And I know this point doesn't have a whole lot to do with Bible lands and customs. It has more to do with theology than anything, but perhaps there are a number of parallels to David's kingdom in this stage to the kingdom of Christ during his first advent, when he was recognized as the king of Israel, and yet he was rejected by his people. And it appears as if he was defeated. Surely, however, the second stage of David's kingdom, in which he was recognized as the king in Hebron and in Jerusalem for 40 years, parallels the future aspect of Christ's kingdom, when he will reign visibly in glory and with honor and power. What I'd like to do with you is trace the places of David's movements during this fugitive, or this first aspect of his kingly reign. And I'll just start by writing the names down, and then we'll trace them on the map just to get an idea. And then we'll trace the major battles that David fought during his kingdom. Tonight, those are the two major things I'd like to do. Where was David when he was chosen and anointed king by God? Right? So he starts out in Bethlehem. And that's in the 16th chapter of 1 Samuel. The 17th chapter tells us about the story of David versus Goliath and the battle that was fought. Where did that take place? What was the name of the place? Was given a name. It was a border between the Jews and the Philistines. Okay, the Valley of Elah, and it was given another name as well. It was also known as Ephes David, border of blood. Right? In this victory, they chased the Philistines north and south to Ekron and to Gath, and the Israelites were victorious. It was really because of David and not Saul. And we looked at that under Saul's, one of the battles in Saul's kingdom. Last class. After this, where did David go after this battle? Any idea?
Gilgal for Samuel and Gibeon for Saul.
Okay. I thought Samuel was in Ramah, and Gilgal was just part of the circuit.
They went to where John Water David was coming. Which was very crazy. he ate at his feet in Gilgal, and he goes up to Ramah, and Saul goes up to Gibeah as well. That doesn't say where David is.
Okay. Well, if you go to chapter 17 where it talks about the battle, and it's David is brought to Saul right in the last verse, identifies himself, and then it says that he would no longer let him go to his father's house. Right? So Saul's in Gibeah, so that's where David went. And I guess we've missed one episode during this time. Before the episode with Philistines, David first was anointed in Bethlehem, and then he is brought to the court of Saul in Gibeah because Saul is depressed and he's having problems, and he asked for somebody to get him a musician to help him, right? So David is brought from Bethlehem to Gibeah, but only temporarily, and then it says in chapter 17 that he went back to his father's house. It's from his father's house in Bethlehem that he is sent to take cheese and wine to his brothers over here, 25 miles west in the valley of Elah. And from this point, David goes and he is brought to the court of Saul in Gibeah. Right? And what results from David's stay in the court of Gibeah? Right? It's really the center of his operations. He is from Gibeah. He goes out and fights Philistines several times. We don't know the exact locations, but he's very successful. The women of the city begin to give him more praise than they give to Saul. Saul becomes afraid of David because he realizes that he's more powerful, more wise, more popular. And eventually, he turns against David, and David is forced to flee. And this takes place in chapter 20. Right at the beginning of chapter 21. Where's the first place that David flees to?
After 1918, flees to Ramah.
1918? Okay, that was before he actually made his final split, because he hadn't actually met Jonathan. He didn't know exactly what was going to develop out of it. So he goes from Gibeah to Ramah, and then from Ramah to Nob. And from Nob to... Pardon? All right. Now, there's two locations on my map for Gath. I have it 23 miles west-northwest of Nob, or it's southwest, 30 or 40 miles. Okay.
I'm supposed to be 5 miles south of that first.
I don't know which one it was. They were both in Philistine territory, either way you look at it. Okay. Probably the southern location is the more accurate one because it's close to Ziklag. And it says later on in the story that the king of Gath gave David Ziklag as a possession, so it makes sense that it was the lower one. Anyway. He found himself in some difficulty there, and how did he escape? How did he escape from that first time?
So we got
feigned madness. Okay, so I suppose if we attach to the event each one of these names, it would help us remember the story. Okay, in Gibeah, Saul tries to kill him, so this is where his exile starts. Okay, Ramah meets Samuel, and Nob gets Goliath's sword and bread. In Gath, he feigns madness. He goes from Gath to Adullam. Adullam is 20 miles southwest of the northern Gath. I suppose it's probably due east from the southern Gath, eh?
Almost down a bit. It's about 10 miles.
Okay, 10 miles. Okay. And what's Adullam?
Cave.
Okay, so he stays in a cave,
Becomes a captain.
right? At Adullam, how many men does he eventually get? 400 men by this time. He does end up with 600 men, but not yet. Okay? He goes from Adullam to okay. Let's see. 22:2 says that he was that anybody that was in distress or in debt or discontented gathered themselves. He became a captain of them, about 400 men, and David went from there to Mizpeh of Moab. Right? Next verse. Now he might have gone by way of, in fact, I don't even know for sure if they know where Mizpeh is. It's not even on my maps.
What happened is he transferred his parents over to Moab and stuff.
I don't know why they would necessarily say that, unless there's traditions or something to that effect.
Yeah. Wish you guys would approve.
I don't get it from the scriptures themselves. Okay. So it's about 50 miles down to the bottom of the Dead Sea from Adullam. That's a fair distance. He goes over there, he stays there for a short time with his family, with the king of Moab, it says. And why does he leave Moab? Anybody know? No? 22, chapter 22, verse 5.
Saul chases after these men.
Nope. Yeah. God sends a prophet and says, leave this place and go back to Judah. Right? So he goes from Moab to the forest of Kerith. Wherever that is, that's an unidentified place, to my knowledge. Yeah, it's pronounced Kerith. Right? In Judah. Okay. Now, while he's here, what message does he get? Right. In what town? Keilah. All right. So wherever he is, he's in Judah somewhere.
Mine has that he's back.
Okay, it could
So I don't know
be.
why they seem to have it.
I always envisioned that it was like south of Hebron somewhere. But I don't know. So anyway, he goes. Keilah. Yeah, chapter 23, the first two verses says that he went to Keilah with the express purpose of. Right, that's why he went to protect the city. This is an interesting story. So he protected the city. Then what happened? Yeah. There was a conspiracy by the very people that he saved their lives in the Philistines, in conjunction with Saul. So these people sent to Saul and said, "Look, you've got this guy down here. Come get him." You know. And so David leaves Keilah, and it says, where does he go? There's one verse there. 23:13. Who is it? All right. So where does it say he went after Keilah?
He escaped the 600 men to strongholds in the wilderness.
Okay. So it says wherever he could go first. Okay. So he was probably working his way eastward or southeast. So wherever. And he's in the wilderness for sure. That's verse 13. It says that. And eventually he works his way down to the wilderness of Ziph. Now Ziph is about 12 miles southwest of Keilah, chapter 23:19. He comes to, it specifically says he was in the hill of Hakilah, which is on the south of Yeshimon. And this is in the wilderness of Ziph. Okay? The hill of Hakilah, I don't know where that is, but he eventually ends up in Hakilah, just out, verse 19, outside of Ziph. And the Ziphites weren't any better than the Keilahites. What do? Promptly. Right? They send a message all the way up north to Saul. Saul comes down and to find him. David moves about 5 miles south to the wilderness of Maon, eludes Saul. So he goes from Ziph to the wilderness of Maon. And then from there he goes to where? Last verse in the chapter. En-Gedi. En-Gedi. Which is where?
Coast of the Dead Sea.
Right, on the west coast of the Dead Sea, about 17 miles northwest of Maon. So he did a lot of traveling around, right? For 600 people to move. It must have been hard for him to go quietly without being seen. Even if it was wilderness, there were always Bedouins probably traveling around here and there. Okay, so the message, chapter 24, verse 1, gets back to Saul that David is in Gedi. Saul comes down, and this is the first time that David spares Saul's life. That takes most of the 24th chapter to tell. Right? We come to the first verse of chapter 25. It tells us Samuel dies, and after that, whether it's because he heard of it or whatever, David says he goes southwest into the wilderness of Paran. Now, the wilderness of Paran is bordered by Kadesh Barnea on the north. That's a long way south. I think it's about 70 miles southwest from En-Gedi. Now, they may have him going from Masada.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it doesn't actually say En-Gedi. The last verse of chapter 24 is, David swore unto Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold.
Okay.
All right? Now, whether that, it says they went up to, it could be.
Masada is up on the hill.
Yeah. So possibly that's Masada. Um, okay, by the 25th, after this is where the story of Nabal and Abigail, it says they worked their way northeast from the wilderness of Paran into the vicinity of Carmel. All right, so they go from En-Gedi or Masada to Paran, and then back from Paran to Carmel. And what happens in Carmel?
They asked Nabal for food.
Okay, why do they ask Nabal for food?
That's when they shoot.
Okay, so he protects Jewish herdsmen, and Nabal resists helping him. Nabal dies. David marries Abigail, his wife. So he gains a bride in exile. Kind of interesting.
That was the second one.
Pardon? Yeah. Actually, it was his third, right? He was married off to Michal, Saul's daughter first.
So they gave her,
Right, and then he married a woman of Jezreel. Forget her name. So he got a wife in exile. Abigail is a type of the church. If you know in theology books, she's considered to be a type of the church. We know nothing about the other one. Okay. So all this is taking place in the vicinity of Carmel. And chapter 26, Carmel isn't all that far from Ziph. Once again, the Ziphites betrayed David and tell Saul that he's in Hakilah. So he must have gone from Carmel, or actually, Hakilah is just north. It's only about 3 or 4 miles north of Carmel to Hakilah. So he's back in the wilderness. Saul is in Hakilah and David's in the wilderness. David comes to Hakilah, spares Saul's life. Saul confesses that he's done wrong in doing that, so Saul goes back to Gibeah, and David goes from Hakilah back to the city of Gath. This is about 35 miles northwest if it's the northern one or to the southern one. Probably the southern one. 25 miles west, southwest. Okay? So he goes from Hakilah to Gath. And this time, he doesn't have to feign madness. Why? This is his second time in Gath. Why? Okay, he's considered to be a refugee, and at the same time, it's not all that easy for the king of Gath just to kick this bum out now. He's not all by himself. He's got 600 warriors, wives, lots of wealth. All right? So he's cordially received by the king of Gath, and eventually he is given the city of Ziklag, which is about 18 miles southwest of Hebron, according to my map.
73 named his wife. Because
Ahinoam. It also mentions her in 25:43. Ahinoam, Abigail. All right? So 27:6 says that Achish gave him Ziklag. Now,
does this mean they'd kill everybody in the paper, or does it mean that he'd dwell with the people of
Ziklag is, if you look on the map, the Besor River it has two branches, and Ziklag is on my map. It's on the northern branch, and it says at the end of that 26th chapter that David went across the other side of the brook Besor to fight Amalekites and Jeshurites and all these other peoples. And all this time, in the 16 months that he was living there, he was bringing back reports that he was killing Jews. And so he was ingratiating himself to this Philistine king through false reports. And this guy was congratulating himself on his great wisdom in getting this Jewish refugee on his side. Right? So this brings us to the last major episode in David's exile. The Philistines were planning a major offensive to the Jews against the north up in Shunem. Their central gathering point was Aphek. That's 55 miles north of Ziklag. Straight north. Aphek. That's sort of west of the hill country of Ephraim. Okay? West of Shiloh, west of anyways, you know where Aphek is on the map. It's in Philistine border country on the west, and they were going to travel 45 miles northeast to Shunem to fight against the Jews who were gathered with Saul. Now, Achish was convinced that David was a genuine ally, but none of the other Philistine kings would accept him. So they sent David back to Ziklag, and while all the Philistines went up north and won the battle, in which Saul and his sons were killed, David went south. He was on the other end of the country. So the book ends with Saul being killed in the very northern borders of Palestine, and David becomes wealthy and respected and loved in the very southern borders of the country. It's kind of an interesting contrast. See? It says that David goes back. The town of Ziklag has been overrun by Amalekites, so he chases them, he catches them, he gets all their booty. And it says he divided the spoil that he got from the Amalekites among at least 15 towns of Judah who had put him up over the years, ranging from Bethel, right here, which is 10 miles north of Jerusalem, all the way to a place down here called Aroer, 40 miles southwest of Jerusalem. Now, it's interesting that of those 15 towns that are mentioned in chapter 30 in this book, there's no mention of Ziph or Keilah. There's no mention of Ziph or Keilah. Why? Yeah. There was no reason to bless those people with bounty. But if you obviously when it says that David wandered in the wilderness, he must have been going to places like Jatir and Sifmoth, Eshtemoa, Rakal, Jerahmeel, cities of the Kenites, Harmah, Boreh, Shan, Athak, Hebron, and many other places. So at the end of his exile, David is exalted, he's enriched, and I don't know if you did you count up the number of miles he traveled? It would kind of be interesting to do that. You could guesstimate it. So. I'm just going to take a minute and do that. So I've got approximately 350 miles, which includes a stint down into Paran of 70 miles in each direction. That's from the time he left Saul in Gibeah until he ends up in Ziklag. About 350 miles. Approximately. Give or take a couple hundred. Okay, now let's look at the battles that David fought once he became king. Right, so the first thing we looked at is David as king, but really without a kingdom, or without an official kingdom. Now we're looking at David as the recognized king, in which he spent 40 years on the throne. I think what I'll do is I'll rub these off and just make a list of the battles here.
I was thinking that'd be like going to the Sudbury Run.
I guess when you think about it, it was maybe over a period of, 7 or 8 years maybe? It's not all that far. Okay. David's first battles were civil war. This is in 2 Samuel chapter 2.
Did he actually fight?
Well, it was his soldiers.
I couldn't see much with it.
No. Joab was his general. Okay. So it was Joab versus Abner. And Joab was the winner. This Joab character was a pretty immoral guy. The end result of that civil war, at least the first episode that's found in chapter 2, was there were 360 Israelites killed and 20 warriors of Judah. So it's 360 to 20. I don't know what kind of odds that is. That's 336 to 2, 18 to 2, so 18 to 1. So it was quite a victory. It says in the first verse of chapter 3 that there was long war between the house of David and the house of Saul. But David grew stronger and stronger, and the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Okay? So David won basically the civil war. Civil war came to a conclusion with a couple of very unjust events. Joab murdered Abner after Abner had deserted to David, and actually brought the whole 10 tribes of the north into David's hand. That's in chapter 3. Now Saul still had one son left up north, and 2 men murdered him in his bed one afternoon. And they cut his head off, and they traveled all through the night, and they brought his head to David, and David killed them. But as a result of these unjust situations, David became the unquestioned authority. There was a period of turmoil even there, but in chapter 5, verses 1 to 5, David became king. So the end result of the civil war in chapters 2 through 5 is that David became king over all Israel. And he's officially anointed as king over all the 12 tribes, chapter 5, verses 1 to 5. Okay, the very first battle that we find David fighting against enemies is in chapter 5, verses 5 to 10. He fights against the Jebusites. In Jerusalem, and he gets a capital. That's the result of his first battle. So he moved his capital from Hebron at the end of that particular event to Jerusalem, where he reigned for the next 33 years. That's chapter 5, verse 5. It also says in chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, that he didn't have to fight Hiram. He had an ally with the king of Tyre. And what did David get out of that? What did he get from the Sidonians, the Phoenicians? It says there, verse 11 and 12. Right? So as a result of this particular relationship, he got a palace. Right? As a result of the Civil War, he became the king over the country. As a result of the Jebusites, he got a capital. As a result of the king of Tyre, he got a palace. Right? All right, the first battle, chapter 5, verses 17 to 21. It's against the Philistines in a place called Rephaim. And immediately on the heels of that, there was another battle, verses 22 to 25, again versus Philistines, same place. Rephaim is a pretty general word. It's called the Valley of Rephaim. The first place is called Baal Perazim, and then it says they chased the Philistines from Geba or Gibeon to Gezer, which is one of their towns. And as a result of that, you have David's victory. It doesn't say what he got out of it. It might have been that as a result of this, he was able to move the ark into Jerusalem. I'm not sure if it was a direct result of that. It seems that's the next thing that chapter 6 tells us. Geba to Gezer, isn't that right, like sort of right through the center of the country, east-west, north of Jerusalem?
Yeah, and goes to Sikar.
Okay, so it's a...
Like here's Jerusalem, right here's Gezer, and it goes to Sikar.
G-E-Z? I thought it was G-E. 525? I've got G-E. Anyway, you might just put that in brackets, that perhaps the result of this particular battle, these battles, that he got a little freedom of movement here. And as a result, he moved the ark. Okay? Perhaps that was why the ark had been left in Saul's kingdom, simply because it was too risky. All right? Chapter 8, verse 1. Fights against the Philistines again in a place called Methagama. What did he get for that? 8-1. What does it say he got? Yeah, read it. Okay, so we got the territory. Okay, I don't know where that particular place. Anybody know where it is? The Pagama?
They have it
General?
general area, probably Mahanaim.
Right, that's across the Jordan.
Okay, they have it going east about 10 miles.
Oh,
So they have this sort of competition on all the end. Just you see where these forces of those things.
okay.
Or army and I don't know. Army forces.
And explain to the ears on the water.
Okay, chapter 8, verse 2. Read what it says there.
It says, and he smote Noah and measured them with a line, casting them down to the ground. Even with 2 lines measured he, put to death, and with 1 whole line keep alive. And so the Moabites became David's servants and brought gifts.
Okay, now brought gifts. I think that's simply a reference to tribute, right? So they became slaves, forced labor, and tribute. Now you wonder where Solomon's wealth came from? His father got the basis. He started these people becoming tribute bearers. Okay, chapter 8, verses 3 to 4. Where did he fight?
Fights Syria.
Okay, and what's the place's name? I think it actually mentions it. Huh?
The son of Rehab, king of Zobah. And after he covered his borders, really good.
As he went to cover them. So the king of Zobah, that's the territory. And what did he get? Okay, chariots, POWs, right? Verses 5 to 8. The Syrians of Damascus came to help the king of Zobah, whose name was Hadadezer, right? Now, what direction is Damascus in relationship to Zobah?
Where's Zobah?
Well, I always thought it was northeast of the Sea of Galilee in this area. Sort of between Bashan and Syria, isn't it? Don't you have any reference to Zobah on your maps?
I get from fighting in Northland, which is east of about 20 miles.
Okay, on this map it has Zobah. Zobah is a strip east of Phoenicia. It's like the middle ground between Syria on the east and Phoenicia on the west. That's quite a bit north, but it probably comes all the way down to the Sea of Galilee. Anyway, the exact location isn't all that critical, but it does say that he fought against Syria and specifically Damascus. And what was the end result of that? Right? Killed 22,000. What else did you get?
Shield and gold.
Right? So you got gold and brass and didn't it say you got tribute money? They gave him gifts. And he put garrisons up there. Right? Chapter 8, verses 9 to 11. This is interesting. We've only got one ally so far, and that's the king of Tyre. Verses 9 to 11 tell us the name of the next ally.